Thank you for tuning in today for another program of Glory Bound. We are here to share the gospel of Jesus Christ through the preaching of God's holy word and Christ-centered music. Our desire is to encourage and uplift those that need a special touch from our Savior. Join us now for another blessed program of Glory Bound.
Hello, this is Glory Bound. Today we have a very special program. We have Pastor Martin Homan with us, and I'm just delighted to have him here. And as some of you may know, he had contracted COVID back in the fall, and he spent 3 months in the hospital and rehab center. So we've asked Pastor Marty to come and talk about his experience and how God has brought him through that. So I'm anxious to hear it, and I know it's going to be a blessing, and maybe it'll even help some of you folks out there. So I'm going to turn the program right over to our pastor, Martin Homan.
Thank you, Elaine. And it is true that on October the 7th, that was a Wednesday, both my wife and I were diagnosed with COVID-19. And I thought to myself, because of Susan's past health issues, I thought, oh my, this is going to kill her. Because all I had heard was that those who were the most vulnerable were those who had issues, health issues. And because of her health issues, I thought, wow, this is going to totally kill her. But instead, she hardly had any symptoms. In fact, you might say she was asymptomatic. But it took me, who never took an aspirin, never went to the doctor, it took me and beat me up like an old drum. The next day, on Thursday, I was running a temperature of about 104, at least that's what it was when I got to the hospital. But what sent me to the hospital was I had a coughing spell that lasted for better than an hour. And it felt like my chest and my lungs were going to just burst. And I started spitting up blood. And so I knew I probably should get that checked out. And so my daughter took me to the hospital, dropped me off because they couldn't come in with me. They took my temperature, was over 104, and they admitted me to Reed Healthcare. On Saturday, October the 10th, I had another coughing spell. This time, it lasted more than an hour and a half. Same type of cough. Lungs felt like they were going to burst, spitting up blood. And a doctor came by. I don't know his name, never saw him before. But he heard my coughing, saw what was going on, and he stuck his head in the door. And he said to me, "You're going to ICU." So they transferred me from the regular room into the ICU. And from October 10th until November 19th, I didn't remember a thing. I was in a medication-induced coma. I had a ventilator for 37 days, and I had a trach in my neck for another 29 days. On the 16th of October, which it was 8 days after I was admitted to Reed Healthcare in Richmond, I was life-flighted to St. Vincent's Hospital. Somebody came up to me just a couple of weeks ago in the church that I pastored and now where I go, and she said to me, she said, "Pastor, I'm so glad to see you." She said, "When you were put into the helicopter, your oxygen level was under 60. And as a nurse, when they read me your vital signs, I didn't believe you were going to make it to Indianapolis. But I made it. and I had wonderful care there as well. And the first thing I remember took place on about November 19th. So I was in the hospital a total of 77 days between the time I first went in to read health care to the time I was released from rehab on December the 23rd, or 2 days before Christmas. When I got into rehab on November 23rd, 2 days before Thanksgiving, I found that I couldn't walk. I couldn't talk because of the trach. I couldn't swallow. I had been on a feeding tube, and I couldn't breathe on my own. And somebody said to me, what was the darkest time of your hospitalization? And it would have been those first 2 days in rehab. I just was beside myself. I had never been in that kind of a situation before. I looked around and I said, this isn't rehab, this is a nursing home, and they sent me here to die. And so I had to, in reality, have the Lord help me with my attitude before I could help myself and help anyone else. And I'm so glad that he did. When I went into rehab, the doctor came and he said, you're not going to probably be out of here to February. And he said, the reason you're still alive, he said, I see from your chart that you were active, you never smoked, you played racquetball and some golf. And I said, Doc, there's another reason I'm alive. He said, what is that? I said, I'm alive because God wanted me alive. He looked at me and thrust his hands this way and said, whatever. But that's the truth. I have 4 friends that have died of COVID. They were all on ventilators. One of them lives here. The other 3 lived in Ohio. And the other 3 that lived in Ohio all followed the updates that my son put on Facebook. He put 26 updates on my condition. And all 3 of these folks would make comments. They would say, Pastor Holman, we're praying for you. Pastor Holman, we know you're going to beat this. Pastor Holman, we know that God's going to take care of this. We know that your ministry is not finished yet. And they were right. I'm still here. But those 3, and then the 4th one, died of COVID. Somebody said to me, what's the difference? People were praying for them like people were praying for you. Absolutely. I had a lot of people praying for me. I walked into the post office a couple of weeks ago, and I had just done a funeral, and I was in a suit. And a lady said to me, she said, I like to see guys in suits. She said, they don't even wear suits to church anymore. And I said, well, where do you go to church? She said, I go to St. Andrew's. I said to her, well, I just retired as pastor of Hillcrest Baptist Church. Her mouth flew open this wide, and she looked at me and she said, Pastor Holman, take that mask off. I want to get a picture of you. My prayer group at St. Andrew's has been praying for you. People were praying for them just like they were praying for me. What's the difference? I don't really know, except this. God is in control. He is the giver of life. He is the one who takes life. And for those who lost their lives, all of them were believers. All of them were godly people. Think about it. They walked into heaven. Now, I know it was harder on their families, but for whatever reason, God chose to keep me here. I had a nurse say to me, she said, I practiced nursing for 40 years. She said, I had people that were on a ventilator as long as you and lived, but they were all younger. I never had anyone that was on a ventilator as long as you were on a ventilator and your age and lived. God allowed me to live. I have no idea why, except God has something else for me to do. You know, one of the great truths of Scripture is that God has a plan and God has a purpose for all of our lives. I hope that you can grab a hold of that. You know, as I laid in that hospital bed one night, I was just coming out of my coma, and I was sedated heavily, and the nurse believed that I was asleep. I sort of woke up. I wasn't really moving, but I was aware of a little of what was going on around me, although I was sedated. But I heard her say to another nurse, I don't think he's going to make it to the morning. Well, I not only made it to the morning, I'm here today. Why God chose to allow me to live, and why God chose to bring some others home who were just as good a Christians, maybe even a better Christian than I am, and yet God is the one in control. And as I laid on that hospital bed, I thought about some of the things we take for granted. Isn't it true we take our health for granted? You know, when I was a young preacher, and I've been preaching for 50 years, but when I was a young preacher, I was visiting somebody in the hospital. And in those days, they often had more than one person in a hospital room. And so I went in and went right to the person I was visiting, and we talked and prayed together, and I started to leave, and the man in the other bed grabbed a hold of my arm. He said, "Are you a preacher?" I said, "Yes, sir, I'm a preacher." He said, "Would you tell the folks in your church something for me?" I said, "Well, it depends on what it is." He said, "You tell them we don't appreciate our health until we lose it." Isn't that true? And so we take our health for granted. You know, when I was first as in the hospital, I was just in a regular room. And I've done a lot of funerals, 989. And I've done a lot of them at a funeral home in Richmond called Stiegel Bernheim Orr. And I spend some time now working some there. And the first as in the hospital, Matt Stiegel called me. He owned Stiegel Bernheim Orr. The nurse that was taking my vitals recognized his name, and she said, "Oh, my Lord." She said, "You're not even dead yet, and the undertaker's already calling." You know what? We take our health for granted. I wonder how many people got up early in the morning, went off to work, and before the end of the day, they recognized and were told, "Hey, you have cancer." I wonder how many of them, maybe before the end of the day, had a heart attack, some other health issue. We take our health for granted. You know what else we take for granted? We take our family and friends for granted. As I laid on that hospital bed in rehab after I came out of the coma, I thought about my wife. If God lets both of us live to June, we'll have been married 50 years. If you've been married, you know marriage is not easy. I tell folks there are 3 rings to marriage. There is the engagement ring, there is the wedding ring, and there's suffering. You know as well as I do that you got to work through it. And for 50 years, Susan and I have been working through it. And I thought about her. And I recognized, hey, boy, I take my family for granted. I take Susan for granted. I take my kids for granted. I've got 3 kids. My kids don't always do what I want them to do. In fact, they sometimes make decisions that I don't approve of. But there's a difference between approval and acceptance. Though I don't approve of everything they do and sometimes the choices they make, they're my children, and I got to always accept them as my children. And you know what? We take our kids for granted, our grandkids for granted. We take our friends for granted. I can't tell you the number of friends who prayed for me, who got on their knees. I got a call one day after I got out of the hospital from a man in Florida. And he said, hey, me and a pastor from Michigan, man I know well. He said it twice a week we call each other and we got on our knees together, me in Florida, him in Michigan, and we prayed that God would spare your life. I can't tell you the people in Richmond, the people at Hillcrest Baptist Church that prayed for me. And I can't tell you the pastors. I got text messages and voicemails from 39 different states from pastors who are praying for me. We take our friends for granted. And as I laid on that bed, I recognized that. But you know, there's one other thing we take for granted, and that's what I want to show you out of God's Word. We take the work of God in our lives for granted. You know, one of the things that you have to understand is God is sovereign. God is in control. I don't know why He chose to take certain people and allow me to make it through all of that. But I know He's in control. In fact, there is a passage of Scripture that really teaches us that in Psalm chapter 139. Because in Psalm chapter 139, it starts out this way. He says, "O Lord, thou hast searched me and known me." That word searched is an interesting word. It means to explore. It means to dig into. Do you know that God could not know you better? You are not just an insignificant speck or an unimportant nobody to God. You are the object of His close personal attention every moment of every day. God said, "Boy, I have searched you and I have known you." And then to show us that, and you know what this means to me? It means to me that God is omniscient. When I say that He's omniscient, I mean there's nothing that God does not know. And He illustrates that. He says, "Thou knowest my downsetting." In other words, my most casual moments are known to the Lord. And my uprising, that means that those days that 24 hours in a day is not enough to get everything done. I got to get done. God knows about it. He knows our good times. He knows our bad times. You know, I'm talking to some people, "Boy, you've lost your job." God knows about that. I'm talking to some people, "You've lost a marriage." God knows about that. I'm talking to some people, "Boy, you've lost your health." God knows about that. There is nothing that God does not know. Instead of getting bitter, look to the only one who can do anything about it. Surrender your life to Him. Turn it over to Him, whatever the issue. Now watch this. Not only does He know the good times and the bad times, but thou understandest my thoughts afar off. Every thought you've ever had, God knows about. Doesn't that blow your mind? Suppose that someone has a thought. You might see the thought as it enters his mind or her mind because their face lights up. You might see that thought as it leaves their mind because they express it in words. But you and I do not have the ability to see what happens between the entrance and the exit. But God does. He understands every thought you've ever had. Why? Because there's nothing He does not know. And then the third verse says, "Thou compassest my path and my lying down." That word compassest is an interesting word. It's the idea of sifting wheat. And I think the idea there is that God not only knows our thoughts, but God also understands the motive behind everything we do. He sifts through all that we do. He understands our motives. And that leads the psalmist to say in the last part of verse 3, He's acquainted with all of our ways. God knew I was going to end up in the hospital on October the 8th. God knew I was going to spend 77 days there. God knew that I was going to be on a ventilator. God knew that I was going to be on a trach. God knew that my family was going to be with me. God, or without me. God knew all that. And God knows all that about you as well. I don't care what you're going through. God is in control. He's at work in your life. It's time we listen to him. It's time we surrender to him. Notice the next verse. He says, for there's not a word in my tongue, but lo, Lord, thou knowest it altogether. Oh, you talk about something that blows your mind. Think about that. Here's how much God knows. God knows every word of every language of every human being on every continent, every moment of every day. Now, it might take God to understand the language of the Kentuckian, but only God can do it. God understands it. He knows every word that you speak. And then look at verse 5. Thou hast beset me behind and before. That word beset, when you break it down, is the idea of besieging. It means literally in the Hebrew to be hemmed in. Whoa, does that describe your life right now? Boy, I feel hemmed in. I don't know what I'm going to do. My back is up against the wall. I'm in this hospital room. I'm in this nursing home. I find myself in this incredible situation that I don't know if I'm going to be able to get out of it. But watch. Even in that situation, it says, his hand is upon me. There's nothing God does not know. And then verse 6 says, such knowledge is too wonderful for me. It is high. Oh, I cannot attain it. I don't understand why God would be so interested in me, but he is. That's why he sent his son to die for you, to shed his blood for you, to endure the cross, and to endure Calvary. And he did it for you, because there's nothing that God does not know. But watch this as we go into the next verse. In verse number 7, whether shall I go from thy spirit, or whether shall I flee from thy presence? You can't run from God. Think about it. Not only is God omniscient, but God's omnipresent. In other words, there is no place where God is not. How can you run from someone where he's everywhere? Jonah thought he could flee from the presence of God. He found out the hard way, you just can't. The next verse says, if I ascend up into heaven, thou. Remember that word thou. Thou art there. If I make my bed in hell, behold, thou art there. Just proof there's no place where God is not. That word thou is abrupt. In the Hebrew, it's direct. And we see that in the next verse. He says, if I take the wings of the morning. He's describing the rays of the morning sun as it pokes its head up over the rim of the world. Do you know if we could travel at the speed of light, it would take us 4 seconds to get to the moon? If we could travel at the speed of light, it would take us 4 years to get to the nearest star, the Alpha Centauri. But when we got there, thou, God, would be there. Because there's no place where God is not. And then he says, and dwell in the uttermost part of the sea. I thought about the one time I've been out on the ocean, the Pacific Ocean, in a little fishing boat. And the farther out into the ocean you went, with the whales and the dolphins beating around your boat, you're thinking, whoa, how insignificant I am. And there are times in your life where you just feel like God is so far away. Might be in a hospital bed. Might be after an accident. Might be after the breakup of a marriage or a relationship. But notice, even there, it says, thy hand shall lead thee. And thy right hand, God's right hand, shall guide me. Verse 11 says, if I say, surely the darkness shall cover me, even the night shall be light about me. I hear people say, oh, I can do this in the dark and it will go unnoticed. No, because even the dark is not dark to the Lord. You see, there is no place where God is not. There is nothing that God does not know. And the third thought I want to leave with you in the 4 minutes I have left is God is a caring God. Notice how he words it. He says in verse number 13, for thou, there's that word again, hast possessed or formed my reins. In other words, the word possessed in the King James means formed. It was, see, you're not the product of Mother Nature. You're the product of the hand of God. And he says, for thou hast formed me. And he goes on to say, thou hast covered me in my mother's womb. You weaved me together in the womb of my mother. Wow, God's eyes were on me in the womb of my mother. You read down through here, and embryologists will tell you it's the perfect description of an embryo in the womb. By the way, do you know that life begins at conception? Now, I know I'm talking to people, and I never lose sight of this, who maybe have made that wrong choice. I can tell you individually, there's forgiveness. God is a God of love, and God's a God of forgiveness if you turn to him. But as Americans, you and I ought to be concerned about our government promoting wholesale abortions. Because life begins at conception. And when you take a life or you take a baby, you're taking a life. God's eyes were on you in the womb of your mother. And he says in verse 15, my substance, that means my frame, my skeleton, was not hid from thee when I was made in secret. There's that description again. And curiously wrought or creatively woven together, it says, in the lowest parts of the earth. Now watch this. Not only was his eyes on you in the womb of your mother, but his eyes were on you as you lived out your life. It says, which in continuance were fashioned when as yet there was none of them. All the way from the beginning. God knew I was going to get COVID. Did I need to be fearful? No. I should be careful, but not fearful. When I spent those 77 days in the hospital, 37 of them on a ventilator, was God there? Absolutely. His eyes were on me. Now watch this. How precious also are thy thoughts unto me. You know what God thinks of you? He thinks you're precious. My wife's grandmother, she used to call me precious. At age 20, it made me angry. Now, I didn't say anything to her. I was a little bit afraid of her. But that's what God thinks about you. Precious in his sight. And then it says, if I should count them, they are more than the number than the sand when I awake. Boy, when I go to sleep, I'm still in his presence. Guys, God's eyes are on you wherever you are. Why don't you turn to him? If you haven't, why don't you surrender your life to him? I don't care what happens to you, that financial collapse. I don't care what happens to you, that loss of health. God is God. He's sovereign. He's in control of all things. Won't you give him your life? Won't you let him have it? Boy, I ask you, turn to him today. Thank you for being on our program.
Thank you for watching Glory Bound. We hope you have enjoyed our program. If you have made any decision for Christ today or have any special prayer requests or questions, please contact us at 765-935-1435 or email us at hbcglorybound@gmail.com.